The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Colorado. It was October 15th, 1887, and the air carried that crisp bite that warned of winter's approach. But for 28-year-old Mary Beth, the cold she felt came from somewhere much deeper than the autumn air. She stood at the window of the boarding house room she could no longer afford, looking down at the courthouse steps where a small crowd was already gathering. Her hands trembled as she touched the silver pendant hanging around her neck, the only thing of value she had left in this world, and the only thing she refused to sell. 3 months ago, her life had been completely different. She and her husband Thomas had owned a small homestead just outside town. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. Thomas worked a copper mine during the day, and she tended their garden and took in sewing from the townspeople. They weren't rich, but they were happy. They had plans. Dreams of maybe having children someday, of expanding their little house, of growing old together on their piece of land. Then came that terrible day in July. The mine foreman had knocked on her door, hat in hand, eyes unable to meet hers. There had been a cave-in. Thomas and 2 other men hadn't made it out. Just like that, in the span of a few seconds, her entire world crumbled just like those mine walls. The funeral was simple. The whole town came, as they did for all the mining families when tragedy struck. Everyone knew it could happen to any of them. The mine owner, Mr. Peterson, even paid for the burial and gave her a small sum to help with immediate expenses. But what she didn't know then was just how much debt Thomas had quietly accumulated. It started with small things. The doctor bills from when Thomas had hurt his back the previous winter. The loan he'd taken to buy seeds for their expanded garden. The credit he'd used at the general store when work was slow. Thomas had handled all the finances, and Mary Beth realized too late that he'd been protecting her from knowing just how tight money really was. The bills started arriving 2 weeks after the funeral. First a few, then a steady stream. The bank manager, Mr. Whitmore, came to see her personally. He was kind but firm. The homestead was mortgaged, and Thomas had used it as collateral for several loans. The total debt was $247, a fortune for someone like Mary Beth. She tried everything. She sold their furniture, their livestock, even Thomas's tools. She took on extra sewing work, staying up until her eyes burned by candlelight. But it wasn't enough. The bank was patient for a while, but they had their own debts to pay. 3 months after Thomas's death, they foreclosed on the homestead. That's when Sheriff Reynolds explained the law to her. In the Colorado Territory, if someone died owing money and their spouse couldn't pay, that spouse could be sold into indentured servitude to cover the debt. It was an old law, rarely used, but still legal. The sheriff seemed almost apologetic as he explained it, but the law was the law. It's not like slavery, he assured her, though his eyes said he wasn't entirely convinced himself. You'll work for whoever buys your contract until the debt is paid off. Could be a few years, maybe less if you're lucky and your buyer is fair. Mary Beth had heard whispers of this happening to other women, but she'd never imagined it could happen to her. She wasn't a criminal. She'd never done anything wrong. But here she was, about to be sold like a piece of property because her husband had died trying to provide for them the night before the auction. She sat alone in her boarding house room, holding the silver pendant. It had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. Her grandmother had told her stories about it, how it had been made by a silversmith in Philadelphia, how it had traveled west with her great-grandmother during the gold rush. This pendant has seen a lot of history, her grandmother had said. It's been through good times and bad, but it's survived, just like the women who wore it. Remember that, child. We're stronger than we know. Mary Beth had never understood what her grandmother meant until now. She could have sold the pendant. It would have brought enough money to at least reduce her debt significantly. But something deep inside her refused to let it go. It was her last connection to her family, to the women who had come before her. If she was going to face whatever came next, she wanted to face it with their strength around her neck. The morning of the auction, she dressed in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes. She braided her long brown hair carefully. and pinned it up, trying to look respectable. She didn't know what kind of person would buy her contract, but she hoped that looking like a decent woman might make some difference. As she walked toward the courthouse, neighbors and friends avoided her eyes. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity. Mrs. Henderson from the general store actually crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Mary Beth understood. She was about to become something less than a free person, and that made people uncomfortable. The courthouse steps were crowded with men of all kinds. Ranchers in their good coats, miners still carrying the dust of their work, shopkeepers who might need help in their stores. They looked at her the way they might look at a horse they were considering buying, evaluating her strength, her health, her usefulness. The auctioneer, a thin man with a loud voice named Mr. Bradley, called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to auction the service contract of Mary Beth Wilson, widow of Thomas Wilson, to satisfy debts in the amount of $247. Mary Beth felt her face burn with shame as he continued. Mrs. Wilson is healthy, can read and write, and has experience in housekeeping, cooking, sewing, and general farm work. The contract will run until the debt is satisfied through her labor. The bidding started slowly. A rancher named Johnson opened with 50 cents, as if he was testing the waters. Another man bid 75 cents. Mary Beth realized with growing horror that these men were literally putting a price on her life, her freedom, her future. "Do I hear $1? called Mr. Bradley. A voice from the back called out, $1, $1.50? $1.50 here." Mary Beth tried to see who was bidding, but the crowd kept shifting. She caught glimpses of faces. Some she recognized, others were strangers. She noticed one man standing apart from the others, leaning against a post at the edge of the crowd. He was tall, wearing a black hat pulled low over his eyes, and he seemed to be watching her rather than participating in the bidding. The bidding continued slowly. $2, $2.25, $2.50. It was clear that most of the men weren't particularly interested. Taking on someone's debt for their labor wasn't necessarily a good deal, especially if the person couldn't work hard enough to justify the expense. "Do I hear $3? Mr. Bradley called out, his voice showing some impatience. There was a long silence. Mary Beth felt her heart pounding. What happened if no one bid high enough to cover her debt? Would they put her in jail? Send her to a workhouse? Then, from the back of the crowd came a quiet voice. $3. It was the man in the black hat. He had stepped forward just enough to be seen, but his face was still shadowed. $3, Mr. Bradley announced with relief. "Do I hear $3.25? Another long silence. The crowd was starting to disperse, losing interest now that the bidding was so low. $3 going once, going twice, Mr. Bradley raised his gavel. Sold to the gentleman in the black hat for $3. $3. Her freedom, her future, her life, all worth $3 to a stranger she couldn't even see clearly. Mary Beth felt tears threatening, but she held them back. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her breakdown. The man in the black hat approached the courthouse steps to complete the transaction. As he came closer, Mary Beth got her first good look at him. He was probably in his 40s, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were simple but clean, the kind a working rancher might wear to town. When he removed his hat to speak to the clerk, she saw brown hair streaked with gray and kind eyes that seemed oddly familiar, though she was certain she'd never met him before. But what struck her most was the way he looked at her. Not like the other men had, evaluating her usefulness or her strength. He looked at her like she was a real person, not property to be bought and sold. And there was something else in his expression, something she couldn't quite identify. Recognition? Sadness? She couldn't be sure. As the paperwork was completed, Mary Beth instinctively reached up to touch her grandmother's pendant. It was then that she noticed the man watching her gesture intently, his eyes fixed on the silver pendant with an expression she definitely recognized now, surprise and something deeper. Something that looked almost like Payne Sheriff Reynolds handed the man the papers that made Mary Beth his legal responsibility. "She's yours for the term of the contract," he said officially. She work for you until the debt is satisfied." The man nodded and finally looked directly at Mary Beth. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat, "my name is Cole Harper. I have a ranch about 15 miles west of here. We'll head out whenever you're ready." His voice was quiet and respectful, so different from what she'd expected. Mary Beth had imagined her buyer would be rough, demanding, maybe even cruel. The wagon ride to Cole Harper's ranch was the longest 15 miles of Mary Beth's life. She sat stiffly on the wooden seat beside the man who had just bought her freedom for $3, her small bundle of belongings clutched tightly in her lap. The autumn wind cut through her thin shawl, but she refused to show any sign of discomfort. She had already lost so much dignity today. She wasn't about to lose what little remained. Cole hadn't said much since they left town. He'd helped her up onto the wagon seat with surprising gentleness, making sure she was settled before climbing up himself. But now, as the horses plodded along the dusty trail leading away from Cedar Ridge, the silence between them felt heavy. An awkward Mary Beth stole glances at her new master from the corner of her eye. He sat relaxed, holding the reins with practiced ease, his attention seemingly focused on the road ahead. But there was something about him that didn't quite fit. His hands, though calloused from ranch work, were cleaner than most cowboys she'd known. His speech, the few words he'd spoken, carried an educated tone that seemed out of place for a simple rancher, and then there was the way he'd looked at her pendant. That moment at the courthouse steps kept replaying in her mind. The recognition in his eyes had been unmistakable, but how could a stranger recognize a piece of jewelry that had been in her family for generations? "Storm's coming," Cole said suddenly, breaking the silence. He nodded toward the horizon where dark clouds were gathering. "We'll make it to the ranch before it hits, but just barely." Mary Beth nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say to him. Should she call him sir or master? The whole situation felt unreal, like something from a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. As if reading her thoughts, Cole continued. "I know this is all strange for you. Mrs. Wilson, I want you to know that I don't expect you to call me master or sir or anything like that. Cole will do just fine." This surprised her. Every story she'd heard about indentured servants involved strict formality and harsh treatment. "That's kind of you," she managed to say. "It's just decent," Cole replied simply. "You're working for me, not owned by me. There's a difference." "Mary!" Beth felt a tiny bit of the tension in her shoulders ease. Maybe her situation wouldn't be as terrible as she'd imagined. But she reminded herself not to get too hopeful. She'd learned the hard way that life could change in an instant. They passed through a valley between two hills, and suddenly Cole's ranch came into view. It wasn't what Mary Beth had expected. Instead of a grand house befitting a man who could afford to buy someone's debt, she saw a modest cabin made of logs and stone. There was a small barn, a corral with several horses, and what looked like maybe 50 head of cattle grazing in the distance. "It's not much," Cole said, noticing her expression, "but it's home." As they pulled up to the cabin, Mary Beth noticed details that puzzled her even more. The porch was swept clean, with a small garden of late-blooming flowers that had been carefully tended. This wasn't the home of a rough bachelor rancher. Someone had been taking care of this place with attention. And Pride. Cole helped her down from the wagon, again with that same gentle courtesy that seemed so natural to him. "Let me show you around," he said. "You'll be staying in the back room. It's small, but it has a good window and it's private." The inside of the cabin was even more surprising than the outside. Books lined shelves along one wall, more books than Mary Beth had ever seen in a private home. There was a small writing desk near the window, with papers neatly stacked and a good oil lamp for reading. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean and organized. "You read?" Mary Beth asked, unable to hide her curiosity about the books. "Some," Cole said, but his tone suggested there was more to it than that. "Feel free to borrow any of them if you'd like. I figure the evenings get long out here." He showed her to a small room at the back of the cabin. It was indeed small, but it was clean and comfortable. with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was actually nicer than the boarding house room she'd been staying in. "I'll let you get settled," Cole said. "When you're ready, come on out to the kitchen and we'll figure out supper." After he left, Mary Beth sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd been a free woman facing an uncertain future. Now she was an indentured servant, but somehow she felt safer than she had in months. Cole Harper wasn't what she'd expected at all. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her extra dress in the small wardrobe and placing her grandmother's Bible on the knitstand. As she did, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. She looked tired and older than her 28 years, but she was still here, still fighting. Her grandmother would have been proud. When she emerged from her room, she found Cole in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot on the stove. The smell of beef stew filled the air, making her realize how little she'd eaten that day. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I started supper. I figured you might be hungry after the day you've had." "You don't need to cook for me," Mary Beth said quickly. "I mean, I should be doing the cooking. That's what I'm here for, isn't it?" Cole looked at her with those kind eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Mrs. Wilson, you've had one of the worst days a person can have. Let me make you a meal. Tomorrow we'll figure out how things work around here." His kindness was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Mary Beth felt tears threatening again, and she turned away to hide them. "Thank you," she whispered. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming her from the inside out. Cole had made biscuits too, and they were better than any she'd tasted. Another puzzle piece that didn't fit the image of a simple rancher. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. Cole paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. A woman I knew once taught me. She said a man should know how to take care of himself." There was something in his voice when he said it, a sadness that made Mary Beth look at him more closely. But before she could ask anything else, he changed the subject. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "What kind of work did you do before today?" Mary Beth found herself talking about her life with Thomas, about their little homestead and their dreams. Cole listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. She found it easier to talk to him than she'd expected. As the evening wore on, she began to notice other things about him. The way he automatically stood when she got up to clear the dishes. The way he said please and thank you for small things. The careful way he spoke as if he was used to choosing his words thoughtfully, and she noticed the way his eyes kept drifting to her pendant. Not in a covetous way, but with that same expression of recognition and sadness she'd seen at the courthouse. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. "You keep looking at my necklace?" she said as she washed the dishes. "Have you seen one like it before?" Cole went very still. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said quietly, "It's a beautiful piece. Very old, I'd guess." "It was my grandmother's," Mary Beth said. "And her grandmother's. Before that, it's been in our family for a long time." "Your family name?" Cole asked, and there was something almost urgent in his voice. "My maiden name was Bennett. My grandmother was Elizabeth Bennett before she married." The dish Cole was drying slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. He bent to pick it up, but not before Mary Beth saw his face go completely white. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said, but his voice sounded strained, just clumsy. But Mary Beth could see that he was far from fine. His hands were shaking as he set the dish on the counter. She was about to ask what was wrong when he suddenly excused himself and stepped outside, saying he needed to check on the horses, through the window. She watched him stand in the yard, his head tilted back to look at the stars. Even in the dim light, she could see that he was deeply shaken by something. But what could her grandmother's name possibly mean to him? She touched the pendant through her dress, feeling its familiar weight. For 3 generations, the women in her family had worn this necklace, her great-grandmother during the journey west, her grandmother through years of frontier hardship, her mother during the brief time Mary Beth had known her. Now it was hers. And somehow it had led her to this strange man who looked at it like it held secrets from his past. Mary Beth had always believed that everything happened for a reason, but she was beginning to wonder if her grandmother's pendant had brought her here for a purpose she couldn't yet understand. When Cole came back inside, he seemed to have composed himself, but Mary Beth noticed that he avoided looking directly at her for the rest of the evening. As she prepared for bed, she wondered what tomorrow would bring. She was beginning to suspect that Cole Harper wasn't just a simple rancher, and that her grandmother's pendant was the key to mysteries she couldn't even imagine. Outside her window, the storm Cole had predicted finally arrived, bringing rain that drummed on the roof and wind that whistled around the cabin. But for the first time in months, Mary Beth felt safe as she drifted off to sleep, the silver pendant warm against her skin. The next morning, Mary Beth woke to the sound of someone chopping wood outside her window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the air crisp and clean. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, expecting to find Cole preparing breakfast. Instead, she found fresh coffee already made and a plate of eggs and bacon keeping warm on the stove, along with a note written in careful handwriting. "Gone to check the north fence. Back by noon. Please make yourself at home." See, Mary Beth stared at the note, puzzled. She was supposed to be working for him, yet he was still taking care of her. She ate the breakfast he'd prepared, wondering, again, what kind of man bought someone's debt and then treated them like a houseguest after eating? She explored the cabin more thoroughly. The books on the shelves were an interesting mix: farming manuals, literature, medical texts, and even some poetry. She pulled out a volume of Shakespeare and opened it, finding notes written in the margins in the same careful handwriting as the morning's note, but it was the medical books that really caught her attention. These weren't simple home remedy guides. They were detailed, professional texts about surgery, anatomy, and diseases. She opened one and found pages of handwritten notes, observations, and even what looked like case studies. This was the work of someone with serious medical training. Mary Beth set the book back on the shelf, her mind racing. Who was Cole Harper, really? Ranch hands didn't usually have extensive medical libraries. And the way he'd reacted to her grandmother's name last night, there was definitely something he wasn't telling her. She spent the morning tidying the cabin, though it was already remarkably clean. As she worked, she found more clues about Cole's mysterious past. In the kitchen, she discovered a small wooden box tucked behind some dishes. Inside were several letters, all addressed to Dr. Coleman Hartwell at various addresses back east. Dr. Coleman Hartwell. Not Cole Harper. Her hands trembled as she looked at the letters. She knew she shouldn't be snooping, but her curiosity was overwhelming. She was about to open one when she heard boots on the porch. Quickly, she shoved the box back behind the dishes and pretended to be washing them. Cole came in, his boots muddy from riding the fence line. "Morning," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Mary Beth replied, trying to keep her voice normal. "And thank you for breakfast. You didn't need to do that. I told you you've had a rough time. It's the least I can do." Mary Beth studied his face as he washed his hands at the kitchen basin. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed the night before. His hands were definitely those of someone who'd done careful, precise work, not just ranch work. And when he spoke, his grammar was perfect, his vocabulary more extensive than most men she knew. "Cole?" she said, then stopped. She wanted to ask about the medical books, about the letters, about why he'd looked so stricken when she mentioned her grandmother's name, but she was his servant, not his friend. Did she have the right to ask such personal questions? "What is it?" he asked, drying his hands on a towel. "I was just wondering, what kind of work do you need me to do?" "Around the ranch, I mean." Cole leaned against the counter, considering. "Well, there's the usual housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, laundry. The garden needs tending before winter sets in. And I could use help with the paperwork, keeping track of the cattle, supplies, that sort of thing." "You said you can read and write?" "Yes, I went to school through 8th grade, and I helped Thomas with his accounts." "Good, that'll be helpful." He paused, then added, "Mary Beth, I want you to know that you're not a prisoner here. You're working off a debt, but you're still a person with rights. If you need anything or if you want to go to town, just let me know." His kindness continued to surprise her. "Thank you," she said softly. They worked together that morning, Cole showing her around the property while she got a feel for what needed to be done. The ranch was small but well maintained. The cattle were healthy, the horses were well cared for, and everything showed signs of careful attention. As they walked, Mary Beth found herself stealing glances at Cole. There was something about the way he moved, the way he observed things, that reminded her of someone. But who? She couldn't quite place the feeling. They were checking the chickens when Cole suddenly stopped and pointed to one of the hens. "That one's not looking well," he said. "See how she's holding her left wing?" Mary Beth looked at the chicken, but she couldn't see anything obviously wrong. "How can you tell?" Cole walked over to the hen and gently caught her, examining her wing with careful, practiced movements. "Looks like she might have strained something. Probably got into a scuffle with one of the others." He set the chicken down and watched her walk. "She should be fine in a few days, but we'll keep an eye on her." "You seem to know a lot about animals," Mary Beth observed. "You pick things up," Cole said, but there was something evasive in his tone that afternoon while Cole was working with the horses. Mary Beth decided to tackle the washing. She was hanging clothes on the line behind the cabin when something fell out of one of Cole's shirt pockets, a small photograph. She picked it up, intending to return it immediately. But when she looked at it, she nearly dropped it in shock. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with dark hair and eyes that looked remarkably familiar. The woman was wearing a dress from at least 20 years ago, and around her neck was a necklace that made Mary Beth's heart skip a beat. It was her pendant. The exact same pendant she wore every day. Mary Beth's hands shook as she stared at the photograph. The woman looked so much like her that they could have been sisters. But how was that possible? And how did Cole have a photograph of someone wearing her grandmother's necklace? Mary Beth? Cole's voice made her jump. He was standing at the corner of the cabin, and when he saw what she was holding, his face went completely pale. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "It fell out of your pocket when I was hanging up your shirt. I was just going to give it back to you." Cole walked over slowly, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "What do you see when you look at that picture?" he asked quietly. I see someone who looks like me. And she's wearing my pendant." Mary Beth's voice was barely above a whisper. "Cole, who is this woman?" For a long moment, Cole didn't answer. He took the photograph from her hands and stared at it, his expression full of pain and longing. "Her name was Elizabeth," he said finally. "Elizabeth Bennett." Mary Beth felt the world tilt around her. "Bennett was my grandmother's maiden name. I know. But that would make this woman ... your mother," Cole finished. "This is your mother, Mary Beth." The words hit her like a physical blow. Mary Beth had never known her mother, who had died when she was just a baby. Her grandmother had raised her and had always been vague about the details of her mother's death, saying only that she had died young and that it was too painful to talk about. "How do you have a photograph of my mother?" Mary Beth asked, though part of her was already beginning to understand. Cole looked up at the sky, then back at her. "Because I loved her," he said simply. "I loved her, and I lost her, and I've been carrying that picture for 20 years. Mary Beth sank down onto the porch steps, overwhelmed. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything." Cole sat down beside her, still holding the photograph. "I wasn't always a rancher," he began. 20 years ago, I was a young doctor back in Philadelphia. I had just finished my training and was working at the city hospital. I was ambitious, maybe a little arrogant. I thought I knew everything there was to know about life." He paused, lost in memory. Then the first met Elizabeth. She was working as a seamstress, supporting herself and her mother. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but it wasn't just her looks. She was kind, intelligent, funny. She made me want to be a better man. "What happened?" Mary Beth asked softly. "We fell in love. I wanted to marry her, but her father had other plans. He'd arranged for her to marry a wealthy merchant, someone who could provide for the family better than a young doctor could." Elizabeth refused, but her father was determined. Cole's voice grew heavy with old pain. We argued about it constantly. I kept telling her to stand up to him, to choose her own life. But she was torn between love and duty. Finally, one night, after a particularly bad fight with her father, she disappeared. She left a note saying she couldn't bear to cause any more trouble, that she was going away to start a new life. And you never saw her again? I searched for her for months. I hired investigators, placed advertisements in newspapers across the country. Nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Cole's voice broke slightly. I eventually gave up my practice and came west, thinking maybe I'd find some trace of her out here, but I never did. Mary Beth stared at the photograph in Cole's hands. When did you find out she was dead? About 5 years ago. I was in Denver, and I met a woman who said she'd known Elizabeth. She told me that Elizabeth had died in childbirth somewhere in Kansas. She'd been using a different name, but the description matched perfectly. Did this woman know about me? Cole nodded. She said Elizabeth had a daughter, but that the baby had been sent to live with relatives back east. She didn't know any details about where or with whom. Mary Beth felt tears running down her face. The days following Cole's revelation passed like a dream. Mary Beth found herself looking at everything differently: the cabin that had become her home, the man who had bought her freedom, and especially the pendant that now felt like a bridge, connecting her to a mother she'd never known. Cole seemed different too, as if revealing his secret had lifted a weight from his shoulders. He moved more easily around the cabin, spoke more freely, and sometimes Mary Beth caught him watching her with a mixture of wonder and sadness, as if he was seeing Elizabeth in her face, but questions still burned in Mary Beth's mind. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, she finally worked up the courage to ask them. "Cole," she said, setting down her sewing, "there's something I don't understand. If you loved my mother so much, why didn't you keep looking for her? Why did you give up?" Cole stared into the flames for a long moment. "I didn't give up," he said quietly. "Not really. I looked for her for years, Mary Beth. I spent every penny I had hiring investigators. I traveled from town to town, showing her photograph to anyone who would look. I even placed advertisements in newspapers across the country." He stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out a worn leather portfolio. "I kept everything," he said, bringing it back to the fire. "Every lead, every dead end, every false hope." "Mary." Beth watched as he opened the portfolio, revealing dozens of letters, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. The papers were yellowed with age, some nearly falling apart. "Look at this," Cole said, pulling out a letter. "This is from a hotel clerk in Kansas City. He thought he remembered a woman matching Elizabeth's description who had stayed there. But when I rode all the way out there, it turned out to be someone else entirely." He showed her another letter, then another. Each one represented weeks or months of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Mary Beth began to understand the pain Cole had lived with for 20 years. "And this," Cole said, his voice breaking slightly. He pulled out a small envelope, different from the others. "This came 5 years ago. It's the letter that told me Elizabeth was dead." Mary Beth's hands trembled as she took the envelope. The return address was from someone named Mrs. Ruth Henderson in Kansas. Inside was a short note written in shaky handwriting. "Dr. Hartwell," she read aloud, "I got your name from the newspaper advertisement you placed looking for Elizabeth Bennet. I'm sorry to tell you that the woman you're looking for died about 18 years ago in our town. She called herself Elizabeth Miller, but from your description, I'm certain it was the same person. She died giving birth to a daughter. The baby was sent back east to family. I'm sorry for your loss. Ruth Henderson." Mary Beth set the letter down, her eyes filled with tears. "This is how you found out?" Cole nodded. "I rode to Kansas immediately, but Mrs. Henderson had died the year before. No one else in the town remembered Elizabeth or knew any details about what happened to her baby. But you kept the letter. It was the only proof I had that she'd existed, that our love had been real. Even though it brought me the worst news of my life, it was still a connection to her." Mary Beth wiped her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Cole, all those years of not knowing The not knowing was the hardest part, Cole admitted. I kept hoping that maybe she was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd chosen to leave me but was happy. Finding out she was dead was terrible, but at least it was an answer. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Finally, Mary Beth spoke again. What was she like, my mother? Cole's face softened. She was remarkable, strong but gentle. She had this laugh that could light up a whole room. And she was smart, probably smarter than me, though I was too proud to admit it then. He reached into the portfolio again and pulled out more photographs. I took these when we were courting, he said, handing them to Mary Beth. Mary Beth studied the pictures with fascination. Here was her mother as a young woman, laughing at something just outside the camera's view. Here she was reading a book, completely absorbed. In another, she was feeding pigeons in what looked like a city park. She loved books, Cole continued. She'd read anything she could get her hands on. And she was always helping people, bringing food to sick neighbors, teaching children to read. She had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. She sounds wonderful, Mary Beth whispered. She was, and looking at you, you have so much of her in you. The way you move your hands when you talk, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, sometimes it's like having her back. Just for a moment, Mary Beth felt overwhelmed by emotion. For 28 years, she'd wondered about her mother, imagined what she might have been like. Now suddenly she had these precious glimpses into Elizabeth's life. Cole, she said slowly, what would have happened if my mother hadn't run away, if she'd married you instead? Cole considered the question carefully. I'd like to think we would have been happy. I would have given her a good life, or tried to, but who knows, we were both young and stubborn. Maybe we would have fought about other things. Maybe I would have disappointed her in ways I can't imagine. Do you think she loved you? I know she did, Cole said without hesitation. Whatever else happened, whatever reason she had for leaving, I know she loved me. She told me so, many times, and I could see it in her eyes. Mary Beth looked down at the photographs again. I wish I could remember her, even a little. She held you, Mary Beth. Even if you don't remember it, she held you and loved you before she died. That matters. How do you know? Cole pulled out one more item from the portfolio, a letter in different handwriting than Mrs. Henderson's. This came a few months after the first letter. I'd written to every church and doctor in the area asking for more information. A midwife finally wrote back. Mary Beth took the letter with shaking hands. The midwife, Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, had written, Dr. Hartwell, I was the one who delivered Elizabeth Miller's baby. She lived for 3 days after the birth, long enough to hold her daughter and name her. She spoke of a man back east who had loved her, and I believe that must have been you. She said to tell him if anyone ever came looking that she never stopped loving him. The baby was strong and healthy when she was sent to her grandmother in Pennsylvania. Tears streamed down Mary Beth's face as she finished reading. She named me. She did, and she thought of me even at the end. Mary Beth stood up suddenly, pacing to the window. The weight of everything she'd learned felt crushing. Cole, I don't understand. If you knew all this, if you knew I was her daughter, why didn't you tell me immediately? Why let me think you were just some rancher who'd bought my contract? Cole was quiet for a long moment. Because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of your situation. Afraid that if I told you everything at once, you'd want to leave. Leave? Why would I want to leave? Because learning about your mother changes everything. Mary Beth, you're not just working off a debt anymore. You're the daughter of the woman I loved more than life itself. That makes our relationship ... complicated. Mary Beth turned from the window to face him. Complicated how? I cared for Elizabeth for 2 years. I was going to marry her, going to spend my life with her. Now here you are, her daughter, living in my house, and I find myself ... He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. What? Mary Beth pressed. I find myself caring about you in ways that have nothing to do with your mother, Cole said quietly. You're not Elizabeth, Mary Beth. You're your own person, brave, kind, strong. And that scares me because I don't want to confuse my feelings for your mother with what I'm starting to feel for you. Mary Beth felt her heart skip a beat. She'd been wondering about her own feelings too. Living with Cole these past weeks, seeing his kindness and intelligence, learning about his devotion to her mother, it had stirred emotions in her that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that I bought your contract to protect you because you were Elizabeth's daughter. But I'm starting to wish you'd stay even after the debt is paid. Not because of who your mother was, but because of who you are." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Mary Beth stared at Cole, seeing him not as her mother's lost love or as the man who'd bought her freedom, but as the person who'd shown her more kindness and respect than anyone in her life. "Cole," she said softly, "I need to tell you something too. I've been having feelings that I don't understand either. You've been so good to me, so gentle and caring. And learning about my mother, seeing how much you loved her, it makes me wish I could have known that kind of love." Mary Beth ... I know it's complicated. I know there are things we need to figure out, but I don't want to pretend these feelings don't exist. Cole stood up and walked to her, stopping just close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't want to take advantage of your situation. You're working for me, paying off a debt. That's not a position where you can make free choices about your feelings." "What if the debt was gone?" Mary Beth asked. "What if I was free to choose?" "Are you saying ... I'm saying that maybe my mother brought me here for a reason. Maybe this pendant didn't just connect me to the past. Maybe it brought me to my future." Cole reached out tentatively and touched the silver pendant at her throat. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Mary Beth was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up to see a well-dressed man in a black suit riding toward the cabin. Something about his formal appearance made her uneasy. Cole emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing a saddle. When he saw the visitor, his face grew serious. "Mr. Whitmore," he called out, walking over to meet the man. "What brings you all the way out here?" Mary Beth recognized the name immediately. Mr. Whitmore was the bank manager who had foreclosed on her homestead. She moved closer, trying to hear their conversation. "Mr. Harper," Whitmore said, dismounting from his horse. "I'm here on official business regarding Mrs. Wilson's debt contract." Mary Beth felt her stomach drop. Had something gone wrong with the paperwork? Was there some legal problem that might take her away from the ranch? What kind of business? Cole asked, his voice carefully neutral. Whitmore pulled out a leather folder from his saddlebag. "Well, it seems there's been an interesting development. You see, we've been conducting an audit of all our accounts, and we discovered an error in Mrs. Wilson's case." "What kind of error?" Cole's voice was sharp now. "It appears that Mrs. Wilson's late husband had a life insurance policy through the mining company that we weren't aware of at the time of his death. The policy was processed through a different bank in Denver, and it took them several months to track down the beneficiary." Mary Beth stepped forward, unable to stay silent. "What are you saying?" Whitmore turned to her with what might have been an apologetic expression. "I'm saying, Mrs. Wilson, that your husband's life insurance policy paid out $300. After deducting the processing fees and our collection costs, there's enough to pay off your entire debt with some money left over." Mary Beth stared at him in shock. You mean she's free?" Cole asked. "Completely free," Whitmore confirmed. "The debt is paid in full, Mrs. Wilson. You're no longer bound by any indentured servitude contract." He handed her an envelope. "This contains the discharge papers and a bank draft for the remaining $47. Mary Beth took the envelope with trembling hands. After everything that had happened, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, she was suddenly free. Just like that ... but as the initial shock wore off, she realized something that surprised her. She didn't feel the overwhelming relief she'd expected. Instead, she felt a strange sense of loss. Being bound to Cole's ranch had brought her the greatest happiness she'd ever known. Now, what would happen? "There is one more thing," Whitmore continued. Mr. Harper, I understand you paid $3 for Mrs. Wilson's contract. The bank will reimburse you that amount, of course. Keep it, Cole said quickly. Consider it a donation to your audit fund? Whitmore looked puzzled but shrugged. Very well, Mrs. Wilson, you're free to go wherever you choose. I assume you'll want to return to town? Mary Beth looked at Cole, searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. His expression was carefully controlled, but she could see uncertainty in his eyes. I need some time to think, she said finally. Of course, Whitmore said. Well, I'll be heading back to town now. Good day to you both. After Whitmore rode away, Mary Beth and Cole stood in awkward silence. Everything had changed in a matter of minutes, and neither of them seemed to know what to say. So, Cole said finally, you're free. Yes, Mary Beth replied softly. I'm free. They walked back toward the cabin together, but the easy companionship of recent weeks felt strained. Mary Beth realized that their entire relationship had been built on the foundation of her debt. Now that was gone, and she wasn't sure what remained. I suppose you'll want to go back to town, Cole said as they reached the porch. Start fresh somewhere, Mary Beth turned to face him. Is that what you want, for me to leave? Cole ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was struggling with something. Mary Beth, last night we talked about feelings, but you were still bound to work here. Now you have choices, real choices, and I don't want you to feel obligated to stay because of anything that happened between us. What if I don't feel obligated? Mary Beth asked. What if I want to stay? Do you? Or do you just think you do because this is the only security you've known since Thomas died? Mary Beth felt a flash of irritation. Don't you think I'm smart enough to know my own mind? I think you're one of the smartest people I've ever met, Cole said, but I also think you've been through more changes in the past few weeks than most people face in years. Finding out about your mother, learning that I knew her, everything that's happened between us, it's a lot to process. Mary Beth sat down on the porch steps, trying to sort through her emotions. Cole was right that a lot had happened. But she also knew that her feelings for him were real, not just gratitude or confusion. Cole, she said, what if we approached this differently? What if instead of me staying as your whatever I was before, I stayed as your partner? Partner? You said yourself that this ranch could use some improvements. I have $47 now, plus whatever I could earn. We could work together to build something better. Cole sat down beside her. Mary Beth, are you sure that's what you want? You could go anywhere now? You could go back east, find your mother's family, learn more about where you came from. Mary Beth had thought about that. The idea of finding relatives who might have known her mother was tempting. But she'd also found something here that she'd never had before, a sense of belonging, of being truly cared for. I might do that someday, she said. But right now, this feels like home. You feel like home. Cole was quiet for a long moment. If you stay, he said finally, it has to be because you want to, not because you feel like you owe me anything. I don't owe you anything, Mary Beth said firmly. You've already given me more than I could ever repay. You've given me back my mother's memory. You've treated me with kindness and respect, and you've shown me what it feels like to be truly cared for. I don't want to leave that behind. And what about us? What about these feelings we talked about? Mary. Beth turned to face him fully. I think we should take time to figure that out. I think we should be honest with each other about what we want and not rush into anything. But I also think we owe it to ourselves to see what might develop. Cole smiled for the first time since Whitmore's visit. You really are Elizabeth's daughter. She always was practical about emotional things. Is that good or bad? It's perfect, Cole said, reaching over to take her hand. Mary Beth, I want you to know that whether you stay or go, whether anything romantic ever develops between us or not, you'll always have a place here. You're family now, in a way, the closest thing to family either of us has. Mary Beth squeezed his hand. I'd like to stay, Cole, not as your servant, not as payment for a debt, but as myself. As Mary Beth Wilson, who happens to care about you and wants to help you build something good here. And if feelings develop beyond that, then we'll deal with it when it happens. We'll be honest with each other and figure it out as we go. Cole nodded. I'd like that very much. That evening they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Mary Beth wore her mother's pendant, but now it felt less like a burden from the past and more like a blessing for the future. She thought about Elizabeth, about the love story that had ended in tragedy but had somehow led to this new beginning. Cole, she said, do you think my mother would approve of me staying here, of us ... whatever we become? Cole considered the question seriously. I think Elizabeth would want you to be happy. I think she'd want you to make your own choices and build your own life. And I think she'd be proud of the woman you've become. I hope so, I know so. As winter approached, Mary Beth settled into her new life at the ranch. She was no longer a servant working off a debt, but a full partner in building something meaningful. She used her $47 to buy supplies for expanding the garden, and she threw herself into learning everything she could about ranching. Cole began practicing medicine again, riding out to treat sick ranchers and miners in the area. Word spread quickly that the old doctor was back, and soon he had more patients than he could handle. Mary Beth helped him organize his practice. Keeping records and managing supplies. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Sometimes Mary Beth caught Cole looking at her with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Sometimes she felt the same way about him. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Cole proposed to her in the garden where they'd planted flowers together. He offered her Elizabeth's ring, a simple band that he'd kept all these years, but Mary Beth gently declined. I want my own ring, she said. Something that belongs to just us, not to the past. So Cole rode to town and bought her a new ring, simple but beautiful. When they married in the little church in Cedar Ridge, Mary Beth wore her mother's pendant as her something old, but everything else was new, her dress, her ring, her future. As they exchanged vows, Mary Beth thought about the strange chain of events that had brought them together. A mining accident, a debt that couldn't be paid, an auction that should have been the worst day of her life. But sometimes she realized the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things we never imagined.